Should we be free to smoke? Would you arrest a shoplifter? And is Rishi Sunak the man to change Britain? This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative peer and former Health Minister James Bethell, Labour MP Rushanara Ali, former Conservative Special Advisor Charlie Rowley and Politics Home reporter Nadine Batchelor-Hunt. On today's programme, can Rishi Sunak actually win? He cast himself as the candidate of change, so will the public buy it? The Prime Minister also wants to end smoking. This man is pleased.
Very large numbers of people living in the UK today will have illness, disability for many years and die because of smoking.
Members of the public tackle shoplifters in Essex. Should we step in? So, end of Conservative Party conference yesterday, ending, of course, with the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's speech to the conference hall. Let's have a look at a spread of the front pages and their reactions. The Times, first of all. Son of a pharmacist casts himself as Thatcher's heir. This was the front page of the Telegraph. Huge decisions to change Britain, including the one on smoking. The Daily Express, game changer, Rishi's radical policy blitz to fix Britain. The Metro had this on the front page, I'm on track for victory, says Rishi. And The Guardian, Sunak ignites Tory civil war after declaring he is change candidate. And that's what we're going to talk about to open the programme. My question to you, James Bethell, first of all, is who is going to be the real change candidate at the next general election? Will it be Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer?
Well, Rishi desperately wants to be that person. That's what this was all about. Will his party let him? That's the question. And what this conference was about was trying to coalesce his party around a proposition that makes him look a bit different to those that have gone before.
Were you convinced?
I think he took concrete steps, yes. But it is unbelievably challenging in his position.
Rushanara, what do you think? Who is going to be the real change candidate? Is it Rishi Sunak, as he tried to say in the way James Bethell has set out, or Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party?
Well, how can Rishi Sunak be the change candidate when he's the fifth Tory Prime Minister with 13 years of Tory government? He was the Chancellor. He's been in government under the previous Prime Ministers. He has presided over record waiting lists, 7 million people waiting for treatment. 121,000 people have died waiting for treatment. This is the legacy of the Conservative Party. We've got absolute chaos in the country. This is appalling. And what we have is an attempt to fool the British public into thinking he is different, but he is part of that lost generation for the country, 13 years, where what we've got is living standards declining, people's mortgages going through the roof, the economy being crashed by his predecessor.
You'll have time to do the track record on the Conservative government. Charlie, do you think it's Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer as the candidate for change?
I think it's got to be Rishi because he is the candidate who, over the last few years, we've seen political turbulence, we've seen economic uncertainty. He has brought stability to the political setting in this country. He's brought stability to the economy. He's the one that is setting out the long-term decisions for the country. That's what this conference was all about. It wasn't a conference packed with policy announcements, but we've got a sense of what this man's about. He's had a year in office and he's tackling the long-term decisions that the country faces, dealing with things like HS2, overfunded, costly, dealing with things like our education system. And we'll see, I think, in the run-up to the next general election, many more policies being announced in due course.
Nadine, is it Rishi Sunak or is it Keir Starmer, who I suppose his critics would say is sticking broadly to Conservative plans, certainly on tax and spend?
I mean, you know, to communicate to the public that he's a change candidate when he has been Prime Minister for, you know, almost a year now. He served in the Cabinet since early 2020. He's a very familiar face. It's going to be very difficult for him to divorce himself from the legacy of the last few years. And of course, the public are aware that the Conservatives have been in power now for 13 years. So, you know, the idea that he's a change candidate on that backdrop, I think, is going to be quite difficult to convince the public of. That said, Keir Starmer is struggling to cut through with the public as that kind of, you know, offering a voice for change, offering a vision. I think Labour conference will be the opportunity for Starmer to say, you know, this is what Labour would do and this is how it would change things. But I think, you know, communication-wise, it's always going to be difficult for a person whose party's been in for 13 years to paint themselves as the change candidate.
Well, the big decision that was confirmed in the speech was the fact that the government, Rishi Sunak, is cancelling the leg of HS2 high-speed rail from Birmingham to Manchester. He said it was a difficult decision, but it was the right one because the facts have changed. The Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves for Labour, tweeted this to Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, referring to something that he himself tweeted in 2020. He said, "No HS2 equals no ambition for our country. Just when the whole world is looking at us, now is a time to be ambitious. Hashtag great decision." He replied in kind to Rachel Reeves by saying this to her. "Yes, it's going well, thank you. How is Keir Starmer?" referring to his opposition to HS2 in 2015. Let's take a look. He looks as if he's frozen there, Keir Starmer, but he does actually say, "I'm against HS2 on cost and on merit." Rushanara, Ali, can anyone sort of claim the moral high ground when it comes to HS2?
Well, Keir raised some issues that were legitimate in his constituency because of the disruption that was going to cause in his constituency, and he was reflecting on those points, and after careful consideration, he's made it clear that he did support HS2. And the wider point is that this is a long-term infrastructure project that had cross-party support, and it took a great deal of work to do that. And what we've got now is the chopping and changing, causing absolute chaos, which is very damaging for investor confidence at home and abroad, and it's damaging for future economic growth. So that's what we've got to really focus on. How do we get out of the economic mess that the Conservatives have put us in? And the answer is not to reverse long-term infrastructure projects. That sends the wrong message to investors.
Well, Jo, do you agree with that analysis?
No, I don't. I'm afraid that the kind of parochial opposition that we saw from Keir, and we also saw from Chiltern's MPs,
Conservative
MPs, all the way along the line, MPs and local authorities have made it incredibly difficult for this infrastructure to be built. They've therefore had to gold plate the engineering, and the cost has spiralled out of control. That political interference has cost us this project, and I am hugely regretful that we aren't capable in this country of overcoming political interference in order to build out affordable infrastructure.
I mean, who is culpable? Because Rishi Sunak, Charlie, said in his speech that they will make people accountable for the mismanagement. And the people accountable, of course, are Conservative politicians, 5 Prime Ministers and 7 Transport Secretaries.
Well, I think I agree with Rushanara. You know, it got cross-party support. It's been a very, very difficult project to get through. And look, on a personal level, and I think if everybody was open about it on a personal level, I think everybody would want to see the project developed. But you've got to balance that international inward investment that Rushanara was talking about, but also being fair to the taxpayer and the people that have mismanaged this project. I mean, if it was still at 30 billion, which was the original estimate, I think we'd be going hell for leather for it. But I think the fact that it is now ballooned to over 100 billion is totally unacceptable, and it's totally unfair to people in the north as well as the south, UK taxpayers that have to wake up day after day to headline after headline about a HS2 project that has been mismanaged by those on the ground. So I think it is perfectly legitimate and right in a sense then to say this cannot go on, this cannot continue. I'm taking a tough, bold decision as the Prime Minister to make sure that actually the money that is allocated, or the money that we do have, can be better spent on other road and rail projects all across the country.
The question, Charlie, is who was responsible for oversight of the management of the project? 7 chancellors, 5 prime ministers, countless transport secretaries. Where were they to oversee the costs and make sure that the mismanagement didn't happen? Surely that is the job of any government. The government has been irresponsible. They have been asleep at the wheel, which is why this is a mess now. And it gets worse. And we both agree that it's bad for investment, bad for confidence, and bad for the future of our country and our economy. And this announcement just adds further chaos.
Well, do you think Labour should continue with HS2? If you win the election next year, should you continue with that northern leg?
Well, what we have to do is look at what the costs are going to be. We're going to have to assess. Genuinely, we're going to have to look at what we inherit if we're in government, if we're fortunate enough to be in government, and make a series of judgment calls based on that. That would be the responsible thing to do, because what we've got is chopping and changing, and it's extremely damaging. So we're not going to be able to make that commitment until we've seen the books, seen what the numbers look like and what the costs are, because we've already got stories of ministers planning to sell off land and all sorts of changes, investors pulling away, businesses having to pull away. So we're going to have to look at that very carefully before we make a judgment.
And it was a classic long-term decision that Rishi Sunak kiboshed.
Well, it's a decision and a project that started in 2009 under Lord Adonis in a Labour government. So there have been successive governments that have looked after this project, that have talked about it, that have developed it. But it is just, I think, where we are after COVID, after we've had the war in Ukraine, where there has been a cost of living crisis, you've got to look at these big infrastructure projects and big spending commitments. And if it's not delivering bang for your buck as a UK taxpayer, then you've got to take tough decisions. And that's what Rishi Sunak has done.
What I would say is that there is, I think, an issue with a bit of short-termism in politics at the moment, where there is that kind of long-term investment that needs to be seen to kind of progress the country for economic growth for the future. I mean, I'm a Birmingham City fan, and there was a letter written from the new owners of Birmingham City saying, we're investing loads in this city at the moment, this is something that we're really passionate about, and HS2 was one of the reasons. And when I go home, and speak to people, they do say HS2 is a huge thing for us because it's going to put us on the map, with a second city, and we don't get that recognition. So, and as you've pointed out, it's not the first project, pushing back net zero, to the car decarbonisation of cars.
Yeah.
That's also had a huge impact on business, and I've spoken to stakeholders about that, and they're also concerned. So I think it does feed into a broader issue of investors are trying to be confident in investing in the UK, and if you're reversing all of these projects, it is damaging for long-term growth.
Well, let's have a look at some other parts of Rishi Sunak's speech. It was a long speech, nearly an hour, and yes, there were some announcements, as Charlie said, perhaps not as many as we were expecting, but this got the biggest cheer, actually, throughout the speech. Let's have a listen.
Patients should know when hospitals are talking about men or women, and we shouldn't get bullied. And we shouldn't get bullied into believing that people can be any sex they want to be. They can't. A man is a man and a woman is a woman. That's just common sense.
What was the thinking behind saying that in that way?
Well, I think, look, again, from my own sort of personal view, is that if you are a transgender in this country, if you feel as though you've been born into the wrong body, making any change to live a happy, healthful, successful life as we all can enjoy, I think is the right thing to do. They should be encouraged. These people should be supported. And I absolutely think everybody agrees that. And I think the Prime Minister would also agree with that too. But I think what we've seen and what I think the Prime Minister was doing there was making sure that actually where, if you are transgender and if you're gender dysphoria and you're suffering in that sense, it is a very, very small proportion of the public. But the debate has become so widespread on political shows, on political programming, within the media. It has caused huge amounts of concern and confusion within policies, whether it's in the criminal justice system, whether it's in hospitals, and it's extended to schools. So I think being absolutely clear about where policies should be directed, from men and women, where there are differences, particularly in the criminal justice system, in health and in education, I think that's a common sense approach, and I think that's what the Prime Minister was trying to articulate.
What did you think when you heard that, Nadine?
I thought it was another example of the Prime Minister able to say something that's kind of cost-free, like the citizens' arrest thing of shoplifters, and that knows it will play to a Conservative base that kind of wants to hear that sort of stuff. Ultimately, I think very few trans people, if any, believe they can actually change their sex. What they're talking about is gender. Gender and sex are very, very different. And I do worry that there is this conflation within political debate about this, and it's deliberately misunderstanding and effectively spreading disinformation. Transgender people make such a small proportion of the population. The stuff they have to go through, the discrimination, the violence, we really need to take the heat out of this debate. And I do think that what we saw from Rishi was playing to a specific base. I mean, probably got one of the biggest cheers of the entire speech. And actually, in real terms, it's not really going to affect people's lives. So I just think really important to take the heat out of this and remember that there are human beings at the heart of this that deserve to be treated with dignity and kindness.
But James, do you think this is the sort of area that Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives are going to be pushing in the run-up to a general election? Because Nadine thinks it appeals to the base, put in that way.
But I think it is tempting, but it would be a regret to me if they go down that route. I agree with Nadine. I hate hearing these kind of simplified, polarising comments because they lack all the nuance that this quite delicate, important debate needs. And Charlie put it very well. You know, there's a huge amount of sympathy for people in these situations. What we don't like is the way in which the debate has become inflamed. And I'd like to see it more love and consideration in the debate and less fire and heat.
Is it a challenge to Keir Starmer, Rushanara Ali, to say something similar, or when he stands up next week in Liverpool?
No, look, I agree with the panellists here, and I think we need to approach this debate sensitively, but we need to recognise that this debate has become very polarising and very divisive. And of course, those who are transitioning, those who are working through these issues need to be treated sensitively with dignity and protection, particularly with young people. So there is not the division that the Conservatives are trying to whip out. This is an attempt to try and whip up hostility. What we hear on the doorstep.
Well, what should Keir Starmer say then? What should Keir Starmer say if he is going to respond, or will he just ignore?
He's made his position very clear, and what we've got to focus on now is the issues that are affecting people on the doorstep. I don't, when we're knocking on doors, people are talking about cost of living, NHS, waiting lists, mortgages. Those are the things that.
But it's interesting it got such a big cheer then. Why? I mean,
and I think I think part of that reason is because yes, it is minority of the population that we've talked about, but it does have the way in which the story is reported at times. It does have a serious impact on women, and there are lots of concerns I've heard in focus groups from women that say they're worried about their sort of single-sex spaces and things like that. So it is something that does come up and could be politically appealing to
what women want to see is rape convictions tackled, because there are serious issues affecting women in our country that this government has failed to address, whether it's health inequality, maternity services. I mean, it is staggering what's happening in terms of the number of deaths per week among women. There are huge safety issues. So if the government is serious about tackling these issues, they need to focus on the real issues that affect men and women, but particularly women.
James?
I also think with the culture stuff as well, we saw it with some things about 15-minute cities or whatever, and this meat tax. It's all part, I think, of a kind of culture warring thing, and we know that the Conservative base does like that sort of stuff, does like rhetoric on that.
But will it work? Will a focus on those sorts of issues work electorally?
I think the climate around politics has become hypersensitised, but the positioning for Rishi is of being the grown-up in the room. And my advice to him would be, if that's the character you're trying to portray, don't fall for the simplistic conspiracy theories and stirring up trouble on the culture wars. What the British public really want are answers to the questions on cost of living, on the NHS, on these really big substantial issues, not on that fluff.
I mean, just before we move on, I mean, it's true in the past that Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, has struggled to answer directly the question about who is a woman and who is a man.
That's what the Conservatives would like you to believe. He's made it very clear. There is a difference between gender and sex. We introduced the equalities legislation. There are protections within the framework. Of course, that's being currently reviewed by the government. That needs to be done sensitively. What we've got is a situation where the government and ministers, and including the Prime Minister, have tried to whip up hysteria and division because it's what Lord Bethel's saying. They want to have an election over over these sorts of issues, as opposed to the issues that really are affecting people's lives. I have my constituents are concerned about the fact that schools are having to close because of the fact that the buildings aren't safe. 170 schools.
So you see it as a distraction from those.
There are serious issues that need to be dealt with sensitively and carefully, as other panellists have said, and we agree with that. But there are big issues affecting people's lives, people not being able to put food on the table, pay their mortgages, their kids going to school, not knowing whether they're going to be safe. You know, we've had a school closure in my constituency with 1,500 kids that are having to be taught from home because the government hasn't got a grip on RAC.
All right, well,
dangerous.
Let's talk about something else that Rishi Sunak made quite a lot of, his personal story and career, becoming the first British Asian Prime Minister. Let's have a listen.
Never let anyone tell you that this is a racist country. It is not. My story is a British story. A story about how a family can go from arriving here with little to Downing Street in 3 generations. What does the Conservative Party offer a family of immigrants? The chance to become Energy Secretary, Business Secretary, Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary, even the chance to become Prime Minister.
I mean, Nadine, it is quite a compelling case, isn't it? Vision of diversity at the top of government within the Conservative Party.
And I think it's something that Labour has struggled to kind of emulate. You know, we haven't had an ethnic minority leader of Labour yet. We haven't even had a woman leader of Labour yet. So I think the Conservatives are ahead in that respect. But also, you know, he's making a speech at party conference. He's obviously trying to send a specific message. If you get down into the kind of, you know, the details on inequality in this country, over 50% of black kids in this country live in poverty. We know there are disparities in the criminal justice system. So the idea that, you know, we're kind of an anti-racist utopia, I'm not saying that's what Rishi thinks, but there are those that do think that. I don't think we're there yet. But, you know, it is a good place in many ways to be an ethnic minority, but we also have to be honest about some of the things that aren't so great if we're going to have progress and we're going to make this country the best it can be.
I mean, it is difficult for Labour to paint that similar vision in terms of politics and at the top of government, isn't it?
Look, we are the party of equality. We are the party that stood up for people. We established, you know, it's the post-war Labour government that introduced for education free at the point of delivery, healthcare and so on, the springboard for enabling people from all communities to succeed and thrive.
But that wasn't my question, Rishanara. It was a sort of who has a better story to tell, if you like, when it comes to the top of government. I'm not sort of disputing all those other things. But no, I mean, do you agree that Labour, despite the things that you said about being champions of equality, haven't got quite the same story?
Look, we have, in the last century, Labour was in power only for 22 years. The Conservatives have had 5 prime ministers. They've been able to chop and change and have different prime ministers within the time, because of the length of time they're in power, to be able to... They've had more opportunities to have different leaders running the country. If we were in power for that long, no doubt we would be in a position where we could have more opportunities to have prime ministers from different backgrounds. Our party is, we have a record number of women and ethnic minorities. We are doing more to make sure that happens. This, you know, it doesn't stop. You have to keep working at it. We are the party that introduced legislation, protections for minority, tackling discrimination.
I mean, Josie, it's true. It's not just about who is sitting in those cabinet seats, is it?
It's also what they do with those
I would say
positions.
that I am very proud of the Conservative Party and how far it has come in my lifetime. I remember when the Tory Party did have a lot of racism in it. At one Conservative club I used to go to, it had "No black served at the bar" sign up on the wall, and that's in my living memory. That has completely changed, and there has been a project to make the Conservative Party a really inclusive organisation. And Rishi put it really well. He's nailed it. The Labour Party has not done the same thing within its organisation. Anti-Semitism under Jeremy Corbyn was a horrific episode for Labour. It made me ashamed to be part of the political culture of this country.
And
there's still a big question over Labour on that point.
Right. I mean, but and you know, your London mayoral candidate accused Sadiq Khan of being, the Jewish community need to be fearful of Sadiq Khan. It is disgusting, and I hope that others, along with Nusrat Ghani, stand up to that kind of rhetoric, that kind of disinformation.
Yes,
that's playing politics with anti-Semitism. That's playing politics with the Jewish community.
Well, I'll get a response on you.
I'm Jewish myself, and I will say that, you know, I was very upset with the anti-Semitism in Labour, but also I would say there is an Islamophobia issue in the Conservative Party as well. You know, Nazgani has been quite outspoken about that, so is Baroness Vorsi. So, you know, I do worry that, you know, Jews and Muslims and ethnic minorities can sometimes be reduced into kind of, you know, political footballs in this kind of stuff. I don't think any political party is perfect on race, and I don't think that, you know, just because a leadership team in the Conservative Party is quite diverse, is, you know, socially, economically, it's not particularly diverse. A lot of them are from private schools. But yeah, I just think we also have to be very, very careful when we start bringing up anti-Semitism in Labour or Islamophobia in the Conservative Party, that it doesn't turn into kind of a back and forth, and it actually is constructive. Because as a Jewish person over the last few years, I just haven't always felt that it has been a constructive conversation.
The two things I'd say are just the second line in what Rishi said, that, you know, yes, he's very proud to be who he is as Prime Minister, but he's even more prouder that it's not a big deal. That just shows how far we've come as a country. And the Conservative Party hasn't been very good. If there's one criticism of the Tory Party that I have, is that we're not very good at, you know, shouting about those kinds of achievements. And there is no vacancy. There won't be a vacancy for many, many years to come until Rishi decides to leave. But if you look at the people that are being named as as people to succeed him, you're looking at, you know, Penny Mordaunt, you're looking at Kemi Badenoch, you're looking at Suella Braverman, perhaps, if you're on that side of the party. So, you know, the diversity within the Conservative Party is there for all to see, and it's a shame that we just haven't seen that in the Labour leadership.
Well, before we move on, James, I wanted to pick up with you on the issue and the policy announcement, the free vote that there's going to be on ending smoking eventually, year on year. Why stop there? Why stop there for Rishi Sunak? He seems to have a very different approach when it comes to tackling obesity.
Well, I agree. Listen, the cheer that you heard in that conference hall was really striking. It shows that public health measures can be popular. I mean, if the polling on all of these measures are incredibly emphatic, 72% support for the New Zealand smoking ban, and even within the Tory party that theoretically is against the nanny state and banning stuff, he got a strong support. Tim Montgomery said he was warming to the idea. I never thought I'd hear today that the membership of the Tory party would come round on that. So I think he should recognise that there are votes in trying to make Britain healthier, that mums and dads want their children to grow up into health. And I expect to see a lot more in this kind of area. Right.
What would you like to see, then, when it comes to tackling the issue of processed foods, for example?
Well, certainly on smoking, if I can just say on that, there is more scope for a smoking levy on the profits to pay for people to give up smoking. And I think people who sell cigarettes should be licensed. But then, as you say, in obesity, there are other things to be done. I think a levy on junk food, a highly processed food levy that put a spotlight, like the sugary drinks industry levy has done, on the contents of the food and generates money to help those who are fighting obesity would be a good place to start.
Right, but Rishi Sunak has said he doesn't consider it to be the same level of public health risk as smoking.
Well, I think we're seeing a politician who's on a personal journey. He is the fittest Prime Minister we've ever had in our history. He runs 10 kilometres in 47 minutes, and I'm personally quite envious of that. He's never drunk. He's never drunk any alcohol. He's never smoked a cigarette. He has an incredibly healthy life. I can't help feeling that we're going to hear more from Rishi Sunak in this area.
Will you be voting for that eventual ban on smoking?
We were the party that introduced the smoking ban in public places. We have made it clear that we want to create a smoke-free nation. We are very supportive of this policy, but there's a broader issue which is about what the government is doing to support the NHS. There are issues around waiting lists. There are issues around ambulances not getting to people dying needlessly because of the failure of this government to support the NHS, to make sure that they get the help they need. There's a workforce issue. Yes, that's been mentioned.
Yeah, the workforce plan.
But, you know, 13 years into government, and what we've seen is the NHS on its knees.
All right.
Those issues haven't been addressed, and they need to fast.
let's look at the timetable for next week for the Labour conference. We will be there, of course. It's a little bit complicated, but you can see 11:30 to 1 o'clock on Monday, taking in the Shadow Chancellor's speech. Keir Starmer's speech, the Labour leader, is on Tuesday. We'll have two programmes you can see there. Wednesday will still be at conference, and Thursday back here in Westminster, 12:15 to 1 o'clock. So please make a note of all those timings. Now, let's talk about shoplifting. You saw in the headlines a video there of what happened in Waltham Abbey in Essex, where members of the public tried to stop two men shoplifting from Tesco. So the question is, should the public confront shoplifters? Well, Policing Minister Chris Philp thinks so. Let's have a look.
The wider public, including shop staff and security guards, do have the power of citizen's arrest.
Do you think they should?
Well, with the greatest respect to Chris, no, I think that's a terrible idea. Trying to apprehend someone is a hell of a thing to try to do. I worked for 10 years at the Ministry of Sound and was on the front gate when we had to try to make control of disruptive people. And I can tell you from personal experience, no one wants to be taken to a police station by a member of the public.
All right, well, let's talk to Katie Bourne, the Police and Crime Commissioner for Sussex. Katie, you were on that panel, I think, with the Policing Minister, Chris Philp. What's your view? Should the public tackle shoplifters?
I think we see it as members of the public increasingly on a daily basis. We see these shoplifters in amongst us. And I get the frustration that the public and the minister are feeling on this. But my advice is always your own personal safety must come first. And I'm at the moment with a whole group of retailers at a big conference in Leicestershire. And somebody from Tesco's was saying that they've seen in the last 2 years alone a massive increase in violence and assaults against their shop workers. So I think your own personal safety must always come first.
How serious is the problem of shoplifting? Is it an epidemic in the way that the CEO of John Lewis, Dame Sharon White, has said?
Well, without a doubt, from my own experience in Sussex, there's an awful lot of it happening. And there hasn't been enough robust interventions going in, whether it's from the police or from other organisations, to prevent those sort of opportunist shoplifters. But now what we're seeing is the retailers coming together and saying enough is enough. And I'm working with a lot of them on this to look at some of the serious and organised criminality that's happening. But at a local level, what I really need is more retailers coming forwards to report this, because we're not seeing enough of it getting reported through to police in the first place.
Right. I mean, reporting is one thing, but actually it seems to be happening on an almost daily basis on high streets across the country. You can understand when there aren't the police officers, as many retailers feel, that people will take matters into their own hands.
Well, so I've got a bit of an issue with this. So the police are very evidence-driven. And if they don't have the data that says this is happening in these stores across our patch, if they can't measure it, they can't tackle it. And I know from experience that less than 10% of what's happening is actually even getting reported to the police. So the more we can encourage retailers to report, the better. The police can then direct their resources there, especially where we're seeing an increase in violence and assaults, which we clearly have done over the last few years.
What did you make, Charlie, of Chris Philp actually advocating that people perhaps should tackle shoplifters? Would you get stuck in?
Well, I do think I'm as qualified as Bouncer Bethel over there from the Ministry of Sound, so I don't think I'd be able to do much use. But Katie's absolutely right. You know, you shouldn't put yourself in harm's way if you're going to be hurt. But then, if you're, you know, a bit bigger than I am, and if you sort of see something taking place, you should, you know, it is totally unfair for the shopkeeper or the shop assistant to try and tackle it themselves. And I think if you're able to assist, maybe as a double act as opposed to independently, in a fair and proportionate way, just to prevent a crime, you know, it's all incumbent of us as citizens to maybe do our bit. But I mean, I can only, you know, think of the invasion of the Just Stop Oil protesters when they invaded the cricket pitch, and Johnny Burstow, you know, rugby tackled this crackpot and dragged him off. And I think the crowd went wild, because you want to see if you can intervene to stop things happening, then you should.
Right. Well, what do you think, Rishanara? Intervening in the way that Charlie has said, or just letting people walk out the shops with stuff?
I mean, it is just shocking that we're in a situation where the government's clearly lost control of the crime prevention agenda and has failed to take responsibility. What they're saying to people... But
what would you do? All right, I accept that, but in this situation, would you step in?
This is a DIY society. Do it yourself. I mean, that is dangerous. You've heard it, and you've heard from the experts, the people who are in the... I mean, basically, it's organised crime, crime gangs who are responsible, largely. There are serious reports about this. It needs police intervention. It needs proper support with community support officers that this government has completely got rid of. If we want to tackle these sorts of crimes, and they are damaging our high streets, they are damaging business, then the government needs to make sure there are policing resources available. The police are on their knees, by the way.
Well, let me get...
That's what's going on. It goes back to the failure of this government.
Well, let's get Katie's response. What, you were shaking your head while Rushanara was talking?
Well, I can't see you, but all I could hear was, with the greatest respect, a load of codswallop. This government has put more money into policing over the last 10 years than ever before. And if you let me finish... Yeah. It's because, and the retailers will be the first to stand up and say, they haven't been reporting enough. I am leading a big project called Pegasus with the top retailers across the country who are coming together with police. So we have a solution to tackle the serious criminality. At a local level, there's two different types. There's the opportunists who tend to be younger, and there are we need more robust interventions with those young people to stop them getting into crime in the first place. Plus, we've got the prolific offenders. And I know from working closely with my own chief constable in Sussex, you can tackle those prolific offenders. We've had some amazing successes.
Rushanara?
Well, I just think it's desperate, really. This is a government that's basically completely lost control of the crime agenda. They've damaged our public services. And the retailers themselves are saying this is not something they can fix. They need police and community support
No, you've said that, but I want to know what your personal response is. You heard Chris Philp. No, but you heard Chris Philp saying, actually, perhaps people should make citizens' arrests, or the public arresting people, or intervening the way Charlie would. What would you do in that situation? If you watch someone pick something up and walk out the shop with it.
Well, our response is that the public should not put themselves in harm's way, but we need to make sure there is a proper policing plan. We need to make sure that the actual safety of communities is provided through community safety officers, neighbourhood officers. We have made announcements on the thousands of additional officers that we will need, and that's costed.
I mean, in a way, Rushanara's got a point. Rushanara's got a point, though, hasn't she, James Bethel? Perhaps people are getting so frustrated because they don't feel there is anybody there. I take the reporting point from Katie, but there isn't enough police resource to do it for them.
I just distinguish between those feelings of frustration and the have-a-go hero desire to try to intervene and make a difference, and the practical realities of dragging someone to the ground and then trying to take them to a police station. That's a pretty difficult thing to do, and I just wouldn't recommend it to members of the public on the whole.
If it is an epidemic, what's driving it? What's driving this huge increase, it seems, certainly from the examples that we hear from retailers?
I mean, it's kind of basic sociology that if people are poorer, crime tends to increase, and we're seeing, the cost of living rising, poverty rising across the country. I've not done lots of studies into this, and I'm not a statistician or whatever, but it's not, for me, it's not a huge surprise that criminality maybe increases in terms of shoplifting. I mean, we've seen an increase in the stealing of baby formula and things like that. I read a story today, I think it was on Sky, about how baby formula banks are rationing now the amount they can give out because of a surge in demand. So when you're on a backdrop where people are quite poor, I'm not saying that's the case for organised crime, but also organised crime does tend to thrive when things are quite difficult in a society. So I would say, it's coinciding with the cost of living crisis, and shoplifting, particularly if it's food, it's not a huge surprise.
Katie, what do you say to that?
Well, from my own experience and a lot of the research we've done, the prolific offenders who you see in the high streets who come back time and time again often have substance abuse issues driven by drugs, alcohol, or so on. And then the serious and organised criminality, that's the bit that's really hitting hard with the major retailers. That is organised crime gangs that are operating.
Do you think cost of living has had an impact, Charlie?
It might well have done, but that's no excuse. A crime is a crime.
People are desperate.
And there should always be support for people that are in that situation. And the best way that you can help people is obviously to get inflation down. That is the biggest tax, effectively, on people's cost of living at the minute. So that's why Rishi Sunak is committed to getting the economy growing for everybody, so they're not in that position. But coupled with the 20,000 police officers, there are more police on the streets. It is exactly as Katie was saying, the reporting of it. And it's not, I think in the extreme, if somebody they may be a bit younger, fancy sort of, taking something from a shop. I don't think it's necessarily sort of pinning them to the ground and dragging them to the police station. They might put it back, they might apologise, OK, you move on, but, don't do it again. But it's just making sure that, we can't just, ignore things that are happening in society. And if we can tackle it as a society together, then I don't think that's a bad thing.
Katie, you're nodding there in agreement. So you would support the sort of approach that Charlie has outlined there? Because actually, a lot of people might be embarrassed and might just say, oh, all right, I'll put it back.
At the end of the day, your own personal safety is paramount. So if you see this happening around you, as long as you're safe, if you feel there's something you can do, then great. At the very least, you can whip your phone out and photograph it and film it while it's happening, because that all builds an evidence base for people to use later on. But, we do have more police officers. We've got a much greater focus on local neighbourhood policing, and police and crime commissioners like me are really focused in this area.
All right, Katie Bourne, thank you very much. The second module of the COVID inquiry is underway, and this is looking at the government's decision-making during the pandemic. The lead counsel, Hugo Keith KC, revealed WhatsApp messages between Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister, Dominic Cummings, his Chief of Staff, and the then Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, portraying a depressing picture of a toxic atmosphere during the pandemic. Let's have a listen.
A significant number of WhatsApp and diary entries refer to Mr. Hancock. It appears to be the case that the Prime Minister and a number of officials and advisers held him in low regard, in particular on account of an apparent tendency, to use their words, to get overexcited and then make stuff up.
Well, you worked with Matt Hancock, James, at the time. Did he make stuff up?
No, that's not how he went about things. And I would point out that there is an operation to try to blame Matt Hancock for everything, and relying on the evidence of WhatsApps does not capture what went on in those days. Specifically, the relationship between Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock was extremely close. They spoke all the time, and I saw Boris Johnson trust his advice time and time again.
But, why then did those WhatsApp messages sort of underline this feeling that actually Matt Hancock was held in low regard by Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings? Now, we can put Dominic Cummings aside, perhaps, but Boris Johnson at the very least.
Well, you're only seeing a few people's WhatsApp messages. You're not seeing everyone's. Dominic Cummings' WhatsApp messages feature very heavily in those reports, and he had a very strong view, which I think has prevailed in some of this reporting. Matt Hancock, as Secretary of State for Health, stepped into a very, very difficult situation and leant in really hard. I think that he took both the department and the NHS with him most of the way and had a huge amount of support. Downing Street was a complicated place to interact with, but that doesn't mean that they all got on badly. It really doesn't.
No, I mean, Sir Patrick Vallance, it's his diary. He was the chief scientific advisor at the time, revealed that Boris Johnson's decision-making during the pandemic was described as bipolar and completely inconsistent. What do you make of that? Well,
that's an observation that has been made by a number of people. Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, had incredible political insight. It was amazing to work with him. He's very quick to understand things, but he did change his mind a lot. And I'm not the only person to have observed this point. He would make a decision early in the morning, change it in the late morning, and change it again in the afternoon.
Would you characterise that as bipolar?
I don't think calling people out for being bipolar or not is helpful or kind or reasonable. He certainly was up and down and had a tendency to change his mind on depending on who he had last spoken to.
I mean, how helpful is this now at this stage, Nadine? Do you think people are still very much interested and want to know what happened in terms of decision-making at the time?
I think one of the points of the inquiry is to make sure the country is prepared if we have another pandemic or when we have another pandemic. I mean, these things tend to happen, serious ones every 100 years or so. So I think the core of the inquiry is that. I also think there'll obviously be families who want answers. And I do think it's important for transparency and to learn from mistakes that, in a pandemic, it may not be a great idea for the Prime Minister to be changing their mind. And maybe the next pandemic we may have a Prime Minister that feels they should be more decisive, because we know in the past that wasn't a great approach to not be decisive. So I think, we have to remember what the inquiry is for. It is for the victims and the families, but it is also to make sure that we don't have excess deaths and, the kind of early chaos we had when the pandemic started in 2020.
We haven't got long. Very quickly, surprised, shocked by the revelations?
Well, I've never said anything unkind about anybody on WhatsApp, so I barely use it.
All right, you've made that disclaimer. Rishanara?
I'm not at all surprised. And what we've got to remember is 220,000 plus people died during the pandemic. I had one of the highest death rates in my constituency. I've lost family members. Many in the country have lost family members. So we need transparency. We need the government and the Prime Minister to provide the information that's been asked of him.
That's all we've got time for today. As I say, I will be in Liverpool next week for the Labour conference at the earlier time of 11:30 on Monday, and we'll have Politics UK tomorrow. Bye-bye.